Welcome to the next online lecture. In this lecture, we'll be finishing our examination of the components of the central nervous system by looking at the anatomy and organization of the spinal cord. We'll also be looking at the protective coverings for the spinal cord called the meninges. Finally, we'll look at the components of the peripheral nervous system by looking more closely at the anatomy and organization of the spinal nerves and how they connect to the spinal cord. You may also notice that in this chapter of your textbook, there's a section on reflexes. We're not going to be covering those specifically in this lecture, but we do look at those reflexes in the lab. So this is an opportunity for some self-directed learning. While most people are somewhat familiar with the spinal cord, we're going to start from the beginning. The spinal cord is a long structure comprised of nervous tissue, so neurons and their associated glial cells, or those supporting cells for nervous tissue. It's represented on this posterior view of the torso by this yellow line. It's part of the central nervous system, and it connects the brain to the peripheral nervous system. The spinal nerves are shown here extending from the spinal cord towards the periphery. In the left-hand image, you can see the bony structures which surround the cord. These bony structures are called vertebrae, and they're stacked on one another to create what's called the vertebral column. This image is showing a lateral view of the vertebral column. The smooth side of the vertebrae is the anterior side, and the side with the spiny processes is the posterior side of the vertebral column. In the region where you see these spiny processes, each individual vertebrae has an opening called a vertebral foramen. It's basically a hole within the region where these spiny processes are. When you stack the vertebrae on top of each other, these successive holes create a canal. This canal is called the vertebral canal, and this is actually where the spinal cord itself is located. Notice that the vertebral column has several curves in it. Each curve is divided into a region. The regions then dictate the name of the vertebrae in that part of the vertebral column, as well as the spinal nerves that exit that part of the vertebral column. The most superior curve is called the cervical region. Inferior to that is the thoracic region, followed by the lumbar region and the sacral and coccygeal regions. So the vertebrae in those regions would be called the cervical vertebrae, the thoracic vertebrae, and then the spinal nerves would be called the cervical nerves and the thoracic nerves, and so on. While the vertebrae are important for providing protection for our very delicate tissue of our spinal cord, they also create a bit of a challenge. Because the vertebral canal curves like this, the spinal cord must also curve to maintain its position in the middle of that vertebral column. Part of how we keep that spinal cord in the middle of the vertebral column is by using the connective tissue layers that surround the spinal cord called the meninges, which we'll be talking more about in a moment. I also want to highlight another feature of the vertebral column that's on this image because you can see them really well here. And that's these spaces or openings that you see between the vertebrae. These openings are called the intervertebral foramina. This is where the spinal nerves will exit the vertebral canal and extend out to the periphery. You can see in the other image here that the first spinal nerve in each region is labeled for you. So cervical nerve 1, thoracic nerve 1, lumbar nerve 1, and sacral nerve 1. The numbering is based on the level of the vertebral column they exit through that foramina, not the level that they exit the spinal cord. This makes sense because the spinal cord has actually ended by the time it reaches vertebrae number 2. So the vertebral canal is actually longer than the spinal cord itself. Part of the reason why the spinal cord is so much shorter than the vertebral column is that there's a difference in speed of growth of these structures during development. The spinal cord stops growing in length around 3 to 4 years old, whereas the vertebral column continues to elongate until early adulthood, basically until you reach your maximum height, anywhere between 18 to 20 years old, depending on the individual, their genetics, their diet, and so on. This difference in length will be important when we start to talk about some of the anatomy of these structures. We'll talk more about the cauda equina and the filum terminale in a second. The spinal cord is our communication link between the brain and the peripheral nervous system. If you think of the nervous system as a road map, the spinal cord is sort of a superhighway where all the roads converge in an organized way to get to the brain or other parts of the body. It's providing a pathway for nerve impulses. Sensory information will gather from the periphery and enter into the spinal cord, and motor information will go out to the muscles and glands from the spinal cord. Another job is to integrate incoming and outgoing information and produce responses. So it helps determine where sensory information, either from our internal or external environment, needs to go after it's been collected from the periphery, and it can also create motor responses. We haven't covered any specific bone structures yet, but the spinal cord extends from the foramen magnum, which is a very large circular shaped hole at the base of your skull, in the bone called the occipital bone, and it extends to the level of the top of lumbar vertebrae number 2. The spinal cord is continuous with the brainstem, so where the medulla oblongata ends, the spinal cord will begin. If you're trying to landmark where L2, or the second lumbar vertebrae, is, it's about the level of the most inferior rib on your rib cage. Even though the spinal cord ends at L2, the spinal nerves will continue down the rest of the vertebral canal and exit at their respective vertebral level. The spinal cord and the spinal nerves have cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral segments, just like I've already mentioned for the vertebral column. And 31 pairs of spinal nerves will exit the spinal cord in total. On this image, you can see that each nerve is labeled within each region, except the coccygeal nerve, which is the most inferior spinal nerve. While the spinal cord is somewhat circular in cross-section, it's not quite round. Instead, it's flattened slightly on one side. The diameter is also not uniform along its length. There's actually 2 enlargements that you can see here on the image. The first one is called the cervical enlargement. The cervical enlargement occurs between cervical vertebrae C4 and T1. We also have the lumbosacral enlargement. The lumbosacral enlargement occurs at about the level of T9 to about T12. These enlargements in the spinal cord are associated with the extra nervous tissue that's needed to supply the additional structures of the upper and lower limbs. So we've got extra muscles, extra bones, and other tissues that need to be supplied with neurons. So those regions of the spinal cord become enlarged in order to accommodate all of those extra structures. Just inferior to the lumbosacral enlargement, the spinal cord tapers into sort of a cone-like structure known as the conus medullaris. It's basically the tip or end of the spinal cord. Even though the spinal cord has ended, the nerves of the lumbosacral enlargement and the conus medullaris continue down the vertebral canal, and they exit via their respective foramina. So they either exit via the intervertebral foramina that we just talked about, or through holes within the sacral bone, called the sacral foramina. The hair-like nature of these nerves coming out of the bottom of the spinal cord is referred to as the cauda equina because it sort of looks like a horse's tail. You'll also notice here on this diagram another structure called the filum terminale. It's an extension of the pia mater connective tissue covering around the spinal cord and anchors the spinal cord to the inferior part of the vertebral column called the coccyx. It acts as a tether for the spinal cord to stop any movement in the superior direction. Now we're going to talk about those protective coverings that surround the spinal cord called the meninges. The meninges are continuous with the meninges of the brain, so you can sort of think of them as a sac or covering that covers the brain and then continues down around the spinal cord. On the image here, we have a cross-section of a portion of the spinal cord. You can see the spinal nerves exiting here, and they're represented here in yellow. The spinal meninges are made up of 3 different layers. The dura mater is the most superficial of the meningeal layers. It's made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. It's also the thickest and strongest of the meningeal layers. One thing that's different about the dura mater and the spinal cord compared to what you see with the brain and the cranial cavity is there's actually a space between the dura mater and the bone. Specifically, the connective tissue on the surface of the bone called the periosteum. So in the spinal cord, there's actually a space between the periosteum and the dura mater. This is referred to as the epidural space. In the vertebral canal, this space is filled with fat, blood vessels, and areolar connective tissue. It helps protect the spinal cord as well as holding the spinal cord in place. Remember, we have to hold it within the center of that canal as it moves through the various curves in the vertebral column. You may have also heard the term epidural before. This is when anesthesia is injected into this space to block the pain receptors exiting certain levels of the spinal cord. Women sometimes get an epidural during childbirth. Since it targets a specific area, it should only affect the spinal nerves that are exiting in that region. So that's how we provide pain relief during delivery, but the mother remains awake. Deep to our dura mater is the next meningeal layer called the arachnoid mater. This is an avascular layer. That means it doesn't have its own blood supply or blood vessels in the layer itself. It contains simple squamous epithelial cells and a delicate network of collagen and elastin fibers. It's named arachnoid mater because the fibers are arranged into a web-like pattern. Between the arachnoid and dura mater, we have a space called the subdural space. It's a very small space and contains only a small amount of serous fluid. Deep to the arachnoid mater, we have the final layer of the meninges, the pia mater. This contains our blood vessels which supply the spinal cord. It tightly adheres to the spinal cord itself, so it covers every little bump and groove in the spinal cord. The pia mater has small extensions of itself that move towards the dura mater and connect it to the dura mater. They occur between each of the spinal nerve roots exiting the spinal cord, as you can see in the image here. These extensions are referred to as the denticulate ligaments. These ligaments help to anchor the spinal cord laterally and prevent it from having side-to-side movement. And again, as mentioned before, we have the filum terminale. It's another extension of the pia mater which extends down to the coccyx. And along with the attachment of the meninges to the foramen magnum, or the base of the skull, it helps to anchor the spinal cord longitudinally, and it prevents superior and inferior movement. So the pia mater is very important for maintaining the spinal cord within the vertebral canal. Between the arachnoid and pia mater, we have the subarachnoid space. This is also continuous with the subarachnoid space of the cranial cavity and contains cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid has a couple of jobs. It cushions the spinal cord and allows for protection, and it also delivers nutrients and removes wastes. So this is looking at another view of the meninges as a cross section. You can see this is the posterior side and this is the anterior side. Even if the directional information is not given on a diagram, you should be able to landmark specific features of the bones or the spinal cord itself to determine the direction of the structures. For example, the body of the vertebrae is anterior and the spiny processes on the vertebrae are on the posterior side of the body. After we finish the bones, you will also be able to tell by the sharpness of these spiny processes at what level of the vertebral column they're actually in. You can also see the spinal nerve exiting here on the spinal cord. You can see here they've labeled that epidural space that I was talking about, which has the blood vessels, fat, and loose connective tissue in it to provide some cushioning for the spinal cord and the meninges. It then shows the dura mater and the arachnoid mater together because the space between them, that subdural space, is so small and with the tiniest bit of serous fluid within it that it's very difficult to actually separate those layers in an anatomical specimen. The space just deep to that's the subarachnoid space, and that's the space that's filled with the cerebrospinal fluid. And then very tight to our spinal cord is where we have the pia mater. You can also see the denticulate ligaments that are coming off the pia mater, attaching in the space that is just inferior to the spinal nerve that's exiting the spinal cord. Now we're going to look at the internal anatomy of the spinal cord a little bit in more detail. A lot of what I'm going to say is written on the following slide. The spinal cord has two portions, an outer white matter portion and an inner gray matter portion. Even without the bony structures, you should be able to orient yourself to the direction of the spinal cord that you're looking at in a cross section based on a few features. On the posterior side, we have a narrow groove called the posterior median sulcus. And on the anterior side of the spinal cord, we have a larger groove called the anterior median fissure. You can also notice that the sulcus and the anterior median fissure partially divide the spinal cord into two halves. Each half of the spinal cord is pretty much a mirror reflection, creating symmetry between the two sides. The white matter of our spinal cord contains myelinated axons which run along the length of the spinal cord and can be either ascending or descending, creating nerve tracts. When we have our nerve tracts grouped together in an organized way, they become columns. This allows for information to be transmitted in an organized fashion throughout the spinal cord. You can see that we have 3 columns within the white matter. Again, this is mirrored on both sides of the spinal cord. There's a posterior, a lateral, and an anterior white column. Within each one of these columns, there will be groups of either ascending or descending tracts that are bundled together because they have similar functions or serve a similar area of the body. Connecting the right and left halves of the spinal cord are the white commissures. In the image here, we have them labeled the anterior one, but there's also a posterior one as well that would be around in this region. That will allow signals to move from one side of the spinal cord to the other side of the spinal cord, or one side of the body to the other side of the body. The gray matter is in the central region of the spinal cord and has a butterfly-shaped or H-shaped pattern. It's composed of 3 horns, the posterior horn, the lateral horn, and the anterior horn. Just to recall, gray matter is made up of neuron cell bodies, dendrites, supporting cells, axon terminals, and there's some shorter neurons that will actually connect the various parts of the spinal cord called interneurons, which is represented here in purple. The horns of the gray matter are also highly organized. This is based on nerve function. The lateral horns, as you can see here, are very small and are found in only the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. This horn is associated with neurons of the autonomic nervous system, which we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks. The posterior horn, which you can see here, is where the axons of all the sensory neurons are entering the spinal cord. And they can either synapse here with the interneurons, shown here in purple, or they can combine with the nerve tract and the white matter and ascend or descend the spinal cord depending on the function of that particular sensory neuron. Since sensory nerve cell bodies are only found in the dorsal root ganglion outside the central nervous system, in this region right here, the cell bodies in the posterior horn are actually all from the interneurons. The anterior horn is much larger and it's sometimes referred to as the motor horn. It's the largest because it contains all the cell bodies for the somatic motor neurons that go to the skeletal muscle. Connecting the right and left sides of the spinal cord in the gray matter region is the gray commissure. In the middle of the gray commissure, we have what's called the central canal. The central canal is continuous with the ventricles of the brain and it contains cerebral spinal fluid. In addition, at each spinal nerve level, we have something called rootlets that leave or enter the spinal cord, depending on if it's carrying motor or sensory information. They're part of the peripheral nervous system, and on the anterior side, we have what's referred to as the anterior or ventral root. This is where we have all the motor neurons that exit the spinal cord. On the posterior side, we have the posterior or dorsal root, which contains all the sensory neurons that are entering the spinal cord. Within the dorsal root, we have something referred to as the posterior or dorsal root ganglion. Since almost all sensory neurons are pseudo-unipolar, their cell bodies are in a sort of extension off the axon. So they get grouped together outside the central nervous system in this dorsal root ganglion. If you can see this bulge in one of the roots off the spinal cord, then you'll know that this is the dorsal side of the spinal cord. When the dorsal and ventral roots merge together, that's called the spinal nerve. So therefore, all spinal nerves have mixed function, or they have both sensory function as well as motor function. So if we want to follow the path of nerve impulses into and out of the spinal cord, we'll just look at some of those pathways now. So if we have nerve impulses for sensations coming from the body, they're coming in that spinal nerve and branching off in the dorsal or posterior root. The axon continues on and it will create a synapse in the posterior gray horn. The cell bodies of those sensory neurons, because they're pseudo-unipolar, will be located in the dorsal root ganglion. The sensory neuron can create a synapse with the cell body of the interneuron. The interneuron can then create a signal which will synapse with possibly a motor neuron. The cell bodies of all somatic motor neurons are found in the anterior horn, whereas the cell bodies of our autonomic motor neurons are found in the lateral horn. Both of those are going to exit via the ventral root and combine with the dorsal root to form the spinal nerve. The somatic motor neurons, of course, are going to target skeletal muscles in the body, whereas the autonomic motor neurons are going to target cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. This slide summarizes some of the points I made on the previous image. Pause the lecture now and go to the Hear the Illustration Spinal Cord Function link in Avenue for a description of the top image, and then go to the Hear the Illustration Spinal Cord White Matter link for the bottom left image. Some of the information is listed on the next slide as well. Welcome back. I just want to note that you are not responsible for the names of the red and blue regions as highlighted in the Hear the Illustration link. As you can imagine, because the regions of the spinal cord are organized in this way, damage to any particular area of the spinal cord will result in characteristic loss of some sort of sensation or motor control. We could have damage from an acute spinal cord injury caused by trauma, or even a tumor could cause a spinal cord injury. If this happens in a certain region, it will only impact potentially motor function or sensory function, or it could be specific to a general area of the body or specific function of the body because the tracts in the white matter are grouped together in this organized fashion. There are a couple of interesting diseases associated with the anterior horn of the spinal cord, and they are in part caused by a degeneration of the gray matter within the horn. The first one is polio. You may have heard of polio, as everyone typically gets vaccinated for it as a child. Polio is caused by a virus called poliovirus, and the virus attacks the cell bodies of the motor neurons that are in the anterior horn, and some of the cranial nerve cell bodies as well. So it results in motor loss and eventually paralysis. Another disease that you may have heard about also has degeneration of the anterior horn of the spinal cord, as well as motor axons descending the spinal cord. This is ALS, or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. It's also referred to as Lou Gehrig's disease. So it attacks the motor neuron cell bodies in the brain and the spinal cord, and eventually the people lose their ability to do things such as speaking, swallowing, and breathing. And typically within 5 years, the disease has progressed to a point that the person can no longer survive. Again, this slide is summarizing some of the points that were made on the previous image. We're now going to move on to the peripheral nervous system by looking at the spinal nerves. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and as I mentioned earlier, they're named and numbered for the region of the vertebral column where they exit the vertebral canal. The first pair exit the vertebral column between the skull and the first cervical vertebra. So it's actually superior to the initial vertebra of the vertebral column. That one's referred to as C1, or the first cervical vertebrae. Then as we move down the vertebral column, the spinal nerves are named for the vertebrae that are beneath them. So spinal nerve C1 would be above vertebra C1. Spinal nerve C2 would be above vertebra C2, and so on, until we get to C7. There are only 7 cervical vertebrae, and there are 8 cervical nerves. So the 8th cervical nerve actually exits below cervical vertebrae C7, and from then on, the names of the spinal nerves are represented as the vertebrae that are superior to them. So at vertebrae C7, there's actually spinal nerve C7 above it and spinal nerve C8 below it. The next vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae 1, or T1, so T1 will exit just below that. The numbering then continues down the spinal cord for the rest of the spinal nerves. We do have 4 pairs of spinal nerves that exit in the sacral foramina. Those are the holes within the sacrum that I mentioned before. Originally, the sacrum was individual bones, but as we develop, those bones fuse together. The rest of the spinal nerves exit through the intervertebral foramina, or those holes that I pointed out earlier between each of the vertebrae on the posterior side of the vertebral column. This leaves us with 8 pairs of cervical nerves, 12 pairs of thoracic nerves, 5 pairs of lumbar nerves, 5 pairs of sacral nerves, and 1 pair of coccygeal nerves. These diagrams show the number of the spinal nerves, and they're numbered from the most superior to the most inferior in both the images. The image to the right also has color-coded the various regions of the spinal nerves. So we have 8 pairs of cervical nerves, 12 pairs of thoracic nerves, 5 pairs of lumbar nerves, 5 pairs of sacral nerves, and 1 pair of coccygeal nerves. The image on the left also shows the various plexuses that we're going to be covering. We will cover them in more detail in a moment, but you can see here that there's the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, the lumbar plexus, and the sacral plexus. It also shows the spinal nerves that are part of each of the plexuses underneath each of the labels. On the right-hand image, in addition to numbering the pairs of the spinal nerves, it also gives you a breakdown of the general function of each of those various areas. As you can see, in a person that has a spinal cord injury, the level of the injury is very important for determining the impact on the function that the person will have. This is in addition to what we talked about earlier with the columns in the spinal cord being damaged. The function will also be determined by whether or not the person has a complete spinal cord injury, or whether they've actually transected or cut the cord entirely, or whether they have a partial spinal cord injury where only part of the cord has been damaged. This is part of the reason why spinal cord injury loss of function varies so much between people. If you had a complete transection of the cervical region, it's going to result in quadriplegia, or loss of function of both the upper limbs as well as the lower limbs, and it may also require a ventilator for breathing if the diaphragm connection is affected. An injury in the upper thoracic region would result in becoming paraplegic. So you'd still have use of your upper limbs, but you would lose lower limb function. As the axons leave the spinal cord, or just before they enter, if we're talking about sensory neurons, they form smaller bundles called rootlets. These rootlets are on both the dorsal and ventral surfaces of the spinal cord, and about 6 to 8 rootlets will merge together to form either the dorsal or ventral roots. These roots then pass through the subarachnoid space, where they pierce the arachnoid or dura mater and merge together to form what we refer to as the spinal nerve. Each dorsal root, as I've mentioned previously, contains a ganglion. Much like the structures of the central nervous system, which have the protection of bony structures, meninges, and the cerebrospinal fluid, the peripheral nervous system also needs protection for the delicate axons that are traveling to various parts of the body. The axons in a nerve are bundled in parallel, and they're typically grouped together by either motor or sensory function. Surrounding each axon, we have our Schwann cells, which create the myelin sheaths. Each axon is then surrounded by 3 connective tissue layers. Immediately around the individual myelinated axons, we have a layer called the endoneurium. It separates the axons from each other. Then these individual axons are grouped together into bundles called fascicles, which are held together by the next connective tissue layer called the perineurium. Surrounding the fascicles are arteries and veins, which provide a blood supply to our nervous tissue cells. There's also adipose or fat deposits and loose connective tissue in this area. Then the groups of fascicles are bundled together to form the spinal nerve, which is surrounded by the most superficial connective tissue layer called the epineurium, which is a dense connective tissue layer and is continuous with the dura mater of the spinal cord. So this particular layer in the spinal nerve is called the epineurium, but as it goes towards the spinal cord, it will become the dura mater. Think of it as the sleeves of a coat. If the body of the coat is the dura mater protecting the brain and the spinal cord, then the epineurium would be the sleeves of the coat protecting the peripheral nerves. Next, we'll look at the branches of the spinal nerves. On this image, you can see many of the structures that we've already learned. So we can see the body of the vertebrae here and the spiny processes, which are on the posterior side of the body. We can see the spinal cord, and we can see that epidural space that contains fat and blood vessels. We can also see the dura mater and the arachnoid mater, and that subarachnoid space, which contains the cerebral spinal fluid. We can see the denticulate ligaments, which is the extension of the pia mater that's going to help anchor the spinal cord laterally within the spinal canal. And we can also see the nerve roots leaving the spinal cord, the anterior or ventral root and the posterior or dorsal root, both of which will come together to form the spinal nerves. We can also see that bulged region in the dorsal root known as the dorsal root ganglion. Shortly after the ventral and dorsal roots come together to form the spinal nerve, the nerve then splits into two main branches called rami or singular ramus. The posterior dorsal ramus of the spinal nerve is innervating the dorsal trunk muscles, or those deep muscles of the back responsible for movements of the vertebral column, and also some of the skin and connective tissue on the back as well. The other branch is the anterior or ventral ramus of the spinal nerve. The destination of this branch depends on where you are in the vertebral column, as we'll see on the next slide. So again, the dorsal ramus innervates the muscles of the vertebral column. The ventral rami on the thoracic region are actually called the intercostal nerves. The intercostal nerves are innervating the intercostal muscles, which are involved in breathing, and they're also innervating the skin in the thoracic region. The ventral rami and the rest of the spinal nerves become the roots of the plexuses, which are essentially the intermingling of nerves which exit the spinal cord. There are 5 plexuses in total. The ventral rami of C1 to C5 form the cervical plexus. The ventral rami of C5 to T1 form the brachial plexus. The ventral rami of L1 to L4 form the lumbar plexus. The ventral rami of L4 to S4 form the sacral plexus. And then the final plexus is the ventral rami of S4 and the coccygeal nerve. So you can picture the plexuses as nerves coming out of the spinal cord from several different levels, but then redistributing their axons after leaving the spinal cord so that the nerves are actually reaching the target tissue, are carrying impulses from several different levels of the spinal cord. The most superior plexus is the cervical plexus. It's one of the smaller plexuses with contributions or roots from the ventral rami of spinal nerve C1 to C4, shown here in yellow. The rami then branch off and intermingle to merge with other branches within the plexus itself. Some of them also run parallel to some of the cranial nerves, as you can see here with the hypoglossal nerve. The main functions of the nerves in the cervical plexus are to innervate the muscles and skin of the head and neck regions, as well as the superior parts of the shoulders and chest. One important nerve that originates as part of the cervical plexus is called the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve arises from the cervical plexus with some contribution from C5, as you can see here. C5 is part of the brachial plexus. This nerve is important as it innervates the diaphragm, which is central to the breathing process. As you can see here, this diagram has a lot of complex connections between the nerves, but you're only responsible for labeling the specific peripheral nerves that I've highlighted, like in this case, the phrenic nerve. However, in general, you should understand that each peripheral nerve is a complex combination of sensory and motor components from various spinal nerve levels, and that it's possible to trace back from a peripheral nerve to see which spinal levels have contributions to that nerve. This is important for understanding certain diseases and injury because we can see where all the contributions to that nerve are coming from. The next plexus we're going to talk about is the brachial plexus. It has roots in levels C5 to C8 as well as T1. There's much more complex mixing of the rami here, as you can see in this image. They branch and reconnect in a specific pattern, forming other nerve combinations known as trunks, divisions, and cords. So first, our original rami will exit the spinal cord and merge together to form 3 trunks. These trunks then branch out again to come together to form 6 different divisions, which are represented here in light green and dark green. Then they'll merge again in another combination to form 3 cords. Finally, they split into 5 main branches, which will become the peripheral nerves highlighted on the slide. And these were going to supply the shoulders and the upper limbs. These branches are the axillary nerve, the radial nerve, the musculocutaneous nerve, the ulnar nerve, and the median nerve. Each supplies a different area, and as with most nerves, the name of the branch or the peripheral nerve indicates the structures that it innervates. So the axillary nerve innervates the deltoid and the teres minor muscles, which are muscles of the shoulder that are involved in arm movement. The radial nerve supplies muscles on the posterior aspect of the arm and the forearm. The musculocutaneous nerve supplies the flexors of the forearm like the biceps brachii. The ulnar nerve supplies some of the forearm and most of the hand muscles. And the median nerve supplies most of the anterior forearm and some of the hand muscles associated with movement of the thumb. The lumbar plexus doesn't have as much mixing as the brachial plexus. It has ventral rami originating at levels L1 to L4. The major nerves of the lumbar plexus are the femoral and obturator nerves. These supply the lateral abdominal walls, the external genitals, and parts of the lower limbs. The sacral plexus has ventral rami in the regions of L4 to S4. 2 main nerves that arise from the sacral plexus are the common fibular and tibial nerves. They're grouped together, as you can see here, and anatomically they're held together by a sheath and referred to as the sciatic nerve. You can see here that there's some contribution of L4 to this particular nerve. L4 is also part of the lumbar plexus, and that's why it overlaps in both these plexuses. The sciatic nerve is the largest peripheral nerve in the body, and it supplies many of the muscles and skin on the lower limbs. And finally, we have the coccygeal plexus. The coccygeal plexus has rami originating from S4 to the coccygeal nerve. It provides innervation for the muscles of the pelvic floor, as well as providing sensory information for the skin over the coccyx, which is the most inferior bone in the vertebral column. This completes this online lecture examining the spinal cord and spinal nerves.